Thank you all for joining us for our session, Black Women at Work on Refusal and Recovery. My name is Dr. Wendi Williams, and wanted to give you all a little bit of a sense of where we're coming from and why we decided to do this particular session. I'm a writer and a scholar about women's leadership and have recently finished a book that is going to be soon out into the world this fall called Black Women at Work. And so when Carrie Motsby-Lute talked about this program, this conference coming, it felt like a perfect opportunity to share a little bit about that work. And Valithia Barnett and I were matched because there's the synergy between the real life experience of some of the ideas discussed in the text that I've written and her story. And so we thought we would set those pieces alongside one another. So to provide a sense of, it's theoretical and it's a framework and it's everyday lived life. So we're so excited to have you join us. We're really grateful for the space to talk about our work and to be seen and heard, which I think is one of the issues that comes up actually for Black women in the work context. And so with no further ado, I'm going to hand over to my dear and new colleague, Valithia Barnett, who will introduce me. We're just introducing each other as part of our getting started.
Actually, if you want, you can just go ahead and finish introducing yourself, and then I'll just introduce myself as well.
Okay, sure. Okay. So my name is Wendi Williams. I'm the Dean of the School of Education here at Mills College. I'm an educator and a psychologist. So I trained as a counseling psychologist and earned my degree in counseling psychology from Georgia State University.
That's important.
Yeah. No, extremely so. My work lies, as I shared already, at the intersection of education and psychology, but also leadership development, intersectionality, and the development of strong women leaders, but beginning in girlhood and really thinking about that. So a lot of the service leadership and things that I've done over the course of my career and continue to do are largely a function of really centering in on how do we support young girls to hold on to their voice. They're born with it. We just have racial and gendered socialization in our society that robs them of the power of it and quiets them. So I'm really grateful for the way that I've been able to do that work in my life and also the ways that we can hold this conversation with you all today.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm very honored. I'm Val Barnett to be here with Dr. Williams. So I am a doctoral candidate student at Loma Linda University. I am finishing up my public health degree, focusing on health policy and leadership. And I've spent the last 10 years of my life as a healthcare executive. So I most definitely have a lot of lived experience. And so, I wanted to join this panel when I talked to Dr. Williams because I'm like, this is such an important topic. It really resonates with me. I actually focused my doctoral research for my doctorate degree on the career journeys of Black women in healthcare, looking at the different barriers that they face and the strategies that they use to overcome such barriers. And so, I'm excited to share my story. I'm excited to be here with Dr. Williams for her to share the details of her book, which will be coming out soon. And so I'm ready to get started.
All right. And so the way that we decided to do this was actually to center Valithia's story first, because that actually doesn't happen as often. We tend to talk about Black women and Black women's leadership and work and professional experiences, but we don't talk to them. So back to you.
Okay. Well, just to share a little bit about my story, I am originally from Chicago, the South Side of Chicago, born and raised, and very proud. I am the first person in my family to actually go to college and then pursue a master's degree and now a doctorate degree that I hope to be finishing this year. And so when I was younger, when I was 15 years old, a little bit of background about why I even went into healthcare. I was diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. And I was the first person in my family to ever be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. And so everyone was super confused. They're like, what is happening? Why is she having panic attacks? What is a panic attack? And so when my mother took me to the doctor, it was actually emergency room because she had no idea what was going on. I distinctly remember the ED physician saying to me, well, what you had was a panic attack. It happens when you have anxiety. I could prescribe you medication or you can just stop being anxious. And that really set the stage for me and how I dealt with my anxiety, how my family dealt with my anxiety. And, as I grew older, I realized very quickly that anxiety is not something you can just stop having. It doesn't really work that way. You don't give it to yourself, and so you can't stop it. And so it's one of the main reasons why I wanted to actually enter healthcare, because I really wanted to really do what I could to change the system, right? When I was an undergrad, I went to undergrad at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I focused on health education and promotion, which was amazing. And then for grad school, I decided to focus on being a healthcare administrator, because I thought like that would be a great position to actually change things, right? And so with that being said, I decided to enter healthcare, which I still to this day think is a great industry with a lot of challenges, to say the least. And throughout my career, I just experienced a lot as a Black woman, to say the least. It's interesting because when it first starts to happen, you go through this phase of, is it me? Like, is it just, am I just imagining things? Like, is this really happening? And it wasn't until I started to talk to other Black women who were in leadership positions or even higher leadership positions, and really started to understand their story and their struggles and the barriers that they face just being a Black female leader, that I started to realize like, oh, I have an interesting road ahead. And it's not just me. I'm not just imagining things. And so what I also found throughout my career, though, when I was growing up, because I'm the first person in my family to go to college, everyone in my family told me, like, listen, go to college, get your degrees, be successful, make money, right? You'll be happy. Like that, that's what you need to do. Do that, right? But as I progressed throughout my career, I wasn't happy, and I just couldn't figure it out. I said to myself, like, okay, well, maybe if I make more money, I'll be happy. Then I get a raise or I get a bonus, and I'd be like, I'm still not happy. Like something just doesn't seem right. It doesn't feel right. I'm still not happy, right? And I think like reflecting back on it, it most definitely was a combination of things I was experiencing, but also truly not understanding or even having the foundation of understanding how to be happy and what happiness was. Because it surely does not come through money. It doesn't come through title at all. And I've had to learn that, right? And this brings me to last year. So last year, I was working in San Francisco, and I was just in a very toxic work relationship. It was just very toxic. And so I made a really hard decision. I had a conversation with my husband, and I said, I haven't been happy for a long time. I don't think I'm going to get happy. It's not going to happen through magic. And mutually, we decided that I was going to leave the workforce and focus primarily on my own business. So one thing that I didn't say was that with being diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, I would use candles a lot to help myself relax. And so I would, I would burn candles, and I would use different scents to like help myself stay calm, kind of recenter myself. I would do it through meditation sometimes, because I was just looking for different ways to help me cope with my anxiety disorder. And so one day, my husband, I want to say this was in 2019, he got so frustrated with me because I would buy an enormous amount of candles, like enormous. Like I just was like, I can never run out of candles. I always need to relax. Like, and so one day he says to me, he says, you buy so many candles, you should just make them yourself. And I was like, okay, that's fine, whatever. So I started making them literally for myself. And so hence me entering into my passion work, right? Not that I wasn't passionate about healthcare, because I am, and I still am. But it was something that I could do to help myself relax, but then I could use the end product to further help me relax, right? So I started sharing it with my friends, and my friends were like, oh, these are so good, you should sell them. Hence the birth of Immerse. So when I left the workforce in December 2021, I decided to be fully devoted to Immerse. And I have found my passion. I found my happiness. Every day I get to wake up and go to work in an environment that's not toxic because I shape it. And I get to do things that help me relax, but also brings a lot of joy to other people. So that's my career journey.
Valithia, wow. Wow, there's so many nuggets there, and I'm hoping that folks who are tuning in and listening to our conversation, we've had a few more folks join, which is, it's nice to see that number grow, are hearing a few of the tidbits around like where you're finding your freedom in your work and your freedom and your leadership. And part of that is to untether yourself from those institutions, to take the leadership of your own entrepreneurship and really of your life. Like, wow. So I really appreciate you sharing your story. Again, you shared a few other tidbits than the last time we talked, so I feel like I'm getting to know you better, which is nice. So we'll transition now, and I'll talk a little bit about this book that I wrote and why I wrote this book, and where, and share. I thought the best way to do this might be just to share some of the pieces of it as we go through. And what I want you to do as we're doing this is to think about pieces of Valithia's story that you've heard that you think may align. There may be questions that come up for you about Valithia's story as you hear me talk about a framework for thinking about Black women's work and professional experiences. We want to see if those, what those are for you, and encourage you to chat them in the box. And if there are questions or wonderings that you have, that you share those with us, because we're going to circle back, and Valithia is going to think about how, if at all, the framework that I'm providing in this book lands on her own experience. So why this book and why now? And I want to just tell you that it's born out of myself, me being triggered, watching. I'm a political news junkie. I'm into politics. And in 2017, 2018, we were in a moment where there were a number of esteemed Black women who had were at the height of their careers and respectability, who were being demolished within the public space, particularly political, but not only. So I'm remembering and calling up April Ryan. She's a political journalist, covers the White House, being told to stop shaking her head by Sean Spicer, who was the media person for the Trump administration. I'm thinking of Kamala Harris, being smirked at by Jeff Sessions during a hearing about his suitability and his fit and his ethics to become the Attorney General. We all saw how that turned out. I'm thinking about Kamala Harris actually during, her as she's in the vice president role. I'm thinking of now Ketanji Brown Jackson. That's a newer iteration of watching a Black woman essentially in the interview process for a job and how she was treated. And I want to say that those were public and those were online and those were very specific to a political space. But what you saw, and I don't know if you all follow this, Valithia, I don't know if you follow this, but I'm also, because I'm a political news junkie, I am on Twitter and I like to watch what happens, because for me, it's my work. It's how I make sense of like what the cultural tone is. The reactions of women from across all walks of life, but particularly Black women, at being triggered of watching the ways that she was treated, because it was not too far afield from how they've been treated in work context. And so this book is born out of this notion that, wow, these women at the height of their careers, esteemed, very powerful actually, are not protected. And in fact, some of the main characteristics, some of the main factors that my family, parents, and community members, teachers said would protect me: a good education, being competent and knowing my job, knowing my work, knowing my worth, that would protect me. Actually, though, those aren't protective factors. I'm thinking they're not. And in fact, what author Karithia Mitchell suggests is that being successful, being brilliant, could actually put a target on your back. And so there's something that happens around moving from a space of any old job that anybody can do to actually being in a leadership position that makes one more susceptible to a type of workplace bullying, violence, and just negative treatment. So I was inspired by those experiences to think about what's happening there. Major and larger premise of this text is that, there is no way in a country that's premised on the extracted labor, both physical body labor of taking babies, but also physical body labor of field work and domestic work and cleaning work with Black women and Black folks in particular, but Black women in particular, that work was extracted and uncompensated and undervalued, but highly relied upon, there is a way in which we can never really get ourselves as a society around truly valuing the work that comes from people who are encased in the brown skin and female bodies. That's the premise, because the work was devalued at the start and also very valued at the start. It just was work that you just didn't feel like you had to pay for. You didn't have to be mindful about in that way. And so that's the heart of it. So in the book, I rely on some of the leadership legacy and labor narratives of Black women. It was fun to go into some slave archives and archives of Black women working in the Jim Crow South, and to think about the ways in which, yeah, same issues, same challenges, same wondering, same questions erupt around what is possible for me, and also what sits in that space of ambition and opportunity and know-how and capability and limited opportunity because you're a woman and because you're Black. So I draw on the work from the women of the Combahee River Collective. If you all do not know who these folks are, I'm just going to put their name in the chat, and as a good teacher, encourage you to go do your work. So go look it up. The Combahee River Collective. They made and they provided an analysis in the 70s, the year before I was born, actually. So that's that leadership legacy that I'm talking about. They were writing and thinking about my condition before I was even took my first breath, but they had been breathing and thinking for a while. And so they were writing and making meaning of a contemporary moment for them as queer Black women who were not fully encapsulated in the women's movement and even a Black women's movement, because their queerness also was another space of othering and around, not engaging in the type of respectability politics that are typically associated with, African-American Christian identity and practices. And so they were really speaking to and speaking from this place of until, when we, as these women who are experiencing a certain identity and experience in the world, these identity politics, when we can live free, then everyone will likely be in that space, because we experience a tremendous amount of unfreedom in the context of a democracy that suggests otherwise. And so for Black women, and another premise in this book is that we really are the test of the fullness of this democracy. If it really is working, because we are citizens, we are born here, we actually are big parts of making this country, then our experience of its democracy should be as full. So I think about that, but there's also this piece of past and connecting it to future. And so the Afrofuturistic Perspective, and interestingly, the CTA conference had that focus last year. So it's really exciting to see. I love this conference so much, because the Afrofuturist perspective is that, we look at the issues and the challenges and the problems that we experience now, which is what the women of the Combahee River Collective were doing. And we forecast, if we do not make changes, if we do not adjust, what are the types of problems and challenges that we are going to see in the future? And that is largely, the work of Octavia Butler, and what she says was the motivation for and what influenced her work. So in that idea of past history, future projection, and the current moment, I pose 4 questions. And I pose 4 questions that are for all of us. They are for Black women, because I do believe in self-determination and autonomy and having a sense of authorship over your life. But they also are about those who seek to be allies with us in our work and in our professional experiences. Those questions are, what can healing, productive, and fulfilling work look like for Black women? What does that look like? Is it that everybody has to go be an entrepreneur because we just can't get these institutions and organizations to work together and to work right for us? Or is there a way in which we can construct work and professional experiences for Black women that are healthy and well, and by doing so, become healthy and well for all, right? The Combahee River Collective statement around our freedom. 2, how can we harness refusal practices? And I'll share a little bit about what I mean by that. Refusal practices to protect our energy and peace of mind while taking ownership of our labor. Because that's a fundamental issue for Black women in this country, the sense of entitlement that a wider swath of people feel to our bodies, our creativity, and our energies. And it is very much laid against the expectation of how we entered into work and the workforce. We didn't make a choice to enter into the workforce in this country. 3, what are the material and psychic conditions required for Black women to work well? What does that really even look like? How do you construct a work environment where Black women experience a sense of wholeness and wellness? I have some ideas. I've worked with a lot of women in various contexts, communications, technology, and whatnot. And I can tell you, particularly when they are entrepreneurs and they carry the leadership in those spaces, how they craft that. And I think that that's a very interesting place for us to go. And finally, the 4th question really is for all of us. Are Black women the only ones who are capable of creating those conditions? Or what does real allyship look like in cultivating the conditions for their work so that we can live and work well, and that we, live and work well and alongside our colleagues? So there are 4 main practices that I have seen and observed in the workforce. And I had a lot of fun writing this book because I was able to think about, Maxine Waters reclaiming her time, and Kamala Harris. Also, some of our popular media perspectives. So watching the ways that Michelle Obama and Meghan Markle have also been treated, because what I wanted to denote in this work is that it happens to them and it also happens down here. And one of the things that I think we witness in social media and the reaction is everyday regular old Black women watching that happen and thinking, gosh, nothing really protects us from that. And as Malcolm X said, Black women are the least protected and respected people on the planet, and it's not untrue. So there are 4 things that I've noticed and that I've characterized. One is called the Passover, not to be confused with religious holiday and acknowledgement. And I'll define it. The crossroads, which I think, Valithia, you'll find some connection with. Looking at the spatial pedagogies of intersectional racism, or in other words, am I supposed to be here? Imposter syndrome. So what do we learn about where we can be and where we can't be? And shush, which is basically the quieting of women. So what I thought I would do is share a bit from each of these chapters that I think gives definition around each of these pieces. And this is the time when I think, as you all are listening, where did you hear some of these elements show up in Valithia's story? Because I see them, and she may provide some more detail about other aspects of the story too, because it is so, because I remember when we talked initially and she shared, and I thought, oh, wow, there's just, we don't even know each other. And look at that, because it is what it is. So when I'm speaking of the Passover, if you all heard the Passover or in her story, share, give us some indication that you're connecting with that. And maybe what part of her story was that. Maybe that can be a way to communicate that to us in the chat. The Passover is the confirmation of invisibility within the context of one's work. What you said, what you did, literally does not matter, except it really does. So it is of consequence to a wider audience, or makes a difference for others who feel its impact. It's work that the organization relies on. It probably is like amazingly fabulous, pretty, brilliant even. And at the same time, it is passed over. It is not seen. It is not seen for being those things. To have one's work and effort not attributed to themselves is quite painful. And at the same time, it takes a lot of energy and creativity to cultivate that work in this professional space. And so painful for it not to be realized. It's not that someone else takes credit for your work, though that does happen too, but rather that you are simply overlooked and not seen as the kind of person who could have done that. And that's what hurts. Typically, the work product is undeniable in its good quality. The institution likely comes to rely and depend on it. And that's what's characteristic of Passover politics. It's that it can't be or is not attributed to you. And it leads to wondering, well, why is that? Is it because I'm a woman? Is it because I'm Black? Those types of questions come up for folks. And you really have no way of knowing, because you could ask the question and sometimes you might get the answer and sometimes you might not. So if you heard this in Valithia's story, share share where that came from, or what you heard in her story. Valithia, I can't wait for you to respond. Do you mind if we just kind of do this back and forth together?
Sure, why not?
All right. You see that in your story, the Passover?
Yeah, for sure. I think it most definitely came in different instances.
Mm-hmm.
the first one that stands out the most to me was me going to other Black female executives, being like, this is how I'm feeling. This is what I'm seeing. Is it just me? Like, does this happen to you? And they're like, yeah, no, it's not just you. This is happening. Like, it happens to us. It's going to keep happening. You're not imagining.
Yeah, it's the type of gaslighting to even have to ask that question.
Exactly.
Because what if they said, oh, maybe you're being too sensitive. I've heard that, and that like breaks my heart because I'm looking for validation. I don't want this to be true, but I do.
Exactly.
I do feel it, and my gut is telling me that something is going on. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about the crossroads. So the crossroads, in the book I write, Black women arrive at the crossroads and decide to part ways for any range of reasons. Many transgressions named throughout the book are those reasons, derived from the origins of how Black women's work and labor are conceptualized in Western, capitalist, white supremacist, and patriarchal frames. The core issue manifests, and Black women respond with choices they have immediately in front of them. Sometimes that means leaving. Sometimes that means staying. But sometimes that means leaving emotionally or leaving creatively. Sometimes it means leaving without being able to give your whole heart because, it gets broken in those spaces. I hear the crossroads, Valithia, all over your story because you left. You started your own business. Your husband really gave you a push, which I appreciate men like partners like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say I most definitely left my last job emotionally before I left physically, because I felt like I needed to do that to preserve my own mental health. So I feel like I had multiple stages of the crossword, right? I left emotionally. For me, the point that I reconciled was I cannot be here. I can leave emotionally, but I cannot leave creatively without fully leaving because I am someone who's so passionate about my work, and it means a lot to me when I produce a body of work for it to be the best product that I could ever produce, regardless of what's going on in the environment, because it represents me. And I honestly feel like that's how I made my final decision to leave physically, was that I felt like I was going to have to sacrifice creatively. And I was like, yeah, no, that's not me. So I need to leave.
There's a little bit of a soul death when you don't get to engage your full creativity and your full self. What we come of us are all of I call them our babies, because you watch an idea come into fruition and then it like starts to live in the world. And so to cut off that creative energy is really cutting off your connection with the source of life.
Yes, I agree.
So the next construct or idea is, I frame it like, am I supposed to be here? And then really, in our intellectual and academic texts, I think of it in terms of the spatial pedagogies of intersectional racism in the context of work. So spatial pedagogies, what are they? They're how you learn where you can be and where you can't be, where you are allowed to be, where you are welcomed, where you're not welcomed. Sometimes there are subtle clues. Sometimes they are very explicit, and very well. So think about the Jim Crow South. There were very explicit cues. There was a sign that said Negroes only for a water fountain, or whites only for a seated area in on a bus, or in a restaurant, or on a cafe, a diner counter. So that's very explicit, but there are also some pretty implicit ways that happens, especially because now technically it's illegal to discriminate against people, except we know that discrimination happens. So what does that look like? I write in the text, she knows and understands that there are rules for her, restrictions that others, little boys and white girls, don't have to follow. She learns very early the limits within which she must operate, and should she have any difficulty in fully abiding by those rules, she simply needs to violate them in the wrong place to get the lesson, often at her peril. If she speaks in the wrong moment or asserts her opinion when it's expected she should not have one, she'll get the lesson. Literally, should she do anything to suggest she expects to be treated as a full and whole human being in spaces and places not designated for her, she will be retaught and retaught that lesson. So pause there. And that happens a lot for us too. Valithia, do you see any of that in some of those experiences that you had? Because I noticed when you told your story this time, you didn't go into specific details. Like you just talked about like, and then I left.
Yeah.
But there are things that happen. If we unpack that experience, there are things that happen over a space and context, a range of time that, give us those indications. Were there anything that you think speak to your experience there?
Absolutely. When you just read that, the first thing that came to my mind were the multiple instances in which I had a specific job title, and that job title gave me the responsibility, right, to take up, set boundaries, ensure that people's workload was equitable, right? And when I would assert myself in those situations, as I got paid every 2 weeks to do, there would be consequences, right? The latest of my last job, I distinctly remember we were going through the pandemic, and one of my teams were the housekeepers. They work so hard. I swear they're the hardest working people in healthcare. That's what I say. And there was a particular unit who wanted them to do something extra. Okay. So, like, think about the dynamic of it. One of the things that changed the most in healthcare was how often something needed to be cleaned.
That's right.
There was no enormous addition of staff. We're talking about people who already work so hard every single day, right? They're so self-sacrificial. And then we add on a million other things, and now we want to add on yet another thing, right? And I just didn't think it was necessary. I'm like, yeah, no, first, that's in someone else's job responsibilities. That group of people should be doing that. And they just don't have the capacity right now, right? As simple as that. I distinctly remember being called into my supervisor's office and her saying to me, well, some of the leaders associated with this unit feel like you're very angry. We're not going to do the angry black
woman. That's kryptonite. Oh, yeah.
You know something I've learned in life so I'm from the south side of Chicago, right? My house can be as slick as it can be, right? But people learn to kind of destroy someone intellectually, right? And so I said, okay, well, thank you so much for sharing that. Can you please provide me some explicit examples that would indicate anger? Like, what exactly did I do that would depict anger? And I remember her saying to me, oh, well, I'm just telling you what they said. And I'm like, no, and I hear what you're saying, but in the course of your conversation with them, in order for you to bring this to me, one of the things that I do for my team is to ask for explicit examples, because what I wouldn't want to do is present something to them that could seem like microaggressions or racist for that matter. So in the course of your conversation, did you ask, the leader for specific examples? Because I can't go off of a generalized statement. If there's a specific type of behavior that I need to focus on, I would appreciate some examples. Well, she didn't give me any.
Did you all see what she did there? She named what was happening to her while it was happening to tell the person, I see what you're doing, and this is what I'm calling that, and why I wouldn't do what you're doing, which is why I would provide specific examples. And what you're doing is microaggressions.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Right.
Very good.
And so I've learned that over the course and I've had to learn that because I've had to deal with it so many different times. And I've learned, if I respond in an angering way, I will be silenced. It'll be, oh, now I understand what they said, versus you're not upholding your responsibility as a supervisor, because I don't appreciate bringing more aggressions to me. What I would appreciate, though, is some explicit examples. So, it's always very interesting.
Oh, gosh. I want us to really hold up that strategy you use, because it's a common one. It's a common one, to bring out from the outsides the things to the forefront in the insides. It actually shows up in a lot of slave narratives around how Black women communicated while also not being seen and heard, but named what was happening in order to get things to change. And it's interesting that even within the context of a leadership position, you are in the space of doing that with someone who I'm assuming is not your equal. Because they always think that they are, even though they're not. And we're all equal under God's eyes, right? It's humanity. But I really am your boss.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's an interesting thing to sit with. Did you want to say something else?
I think the most interesting thing about it, and again, I've been through this a lot with different races, but I think the more intense form of microaggression and racism I've ever experienced, just being 100% honest, has been under the leadership of a Black woman. And that something that has shocked me, because that supervisor was a Black woman.
Well, let's talk about that because one of our participants, Samantha, put a question, and I told her that we would get to it, but we're here, and I'm of that moment. Samantha says, "How do we deal with it when it's our own people doing this to us?" I want to first let's explain why that happens, right? So the psychologist in me doesn't want to get into a thing where now we're going to start saying that Black women are horrible leaders because they're doing this, because that is a mistake, and we're not going to play that particular game, right? Why would that happen? Why do you think that happened in your context with the Black women that you're working with?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So my perspective on this, because it's a Black woman, people have done this to me. They've come to me about my Black employees, whether it be Black female, Black male, and they've used microaggressions and they've used like undertones of racism in conversation. But I think that when you're in a system where that is prominent, there has to be something that is within you that gives you enough confidence and enough wherewithal to say, okay, well, give me an explicit example, right? Because that silencing of Black people in the workforce is perpetuary. It keeps happening. It's systematic, right? It has to be something in you that says, okay, I'm a Black woman in this situation, right? I've been through these experiences. So let me make sure that before I even think to communicate this message that's full of microaggressions to another Black person, that I fully comprehend the situation. And if what they're saying isn't evident, like if they don't have any examples, to correct it, right? Because I've had situations where someone's like, oh, this person is just dumb. And I say, well, wait a minute, let's go back a little bit. This person is master's degree educated, so I'm his supervisor, and I don't find him to be dumb. I find him to be highly intelligent. So tell me what led you to that conclusion, right? But it requires a certain level of confidence and analytical ability to question it at its core. That's my opinion.
And what I will say, and I thank you. I just imagine how sad it is for the industry to have lost you as a leader in that space. Actually, is what I'm mourning a little bit right now. I think that there's also something that we have to understand about internalized racial oppression, and within the context of professional space and imposter syndrome. One of the ways to be less of an imposter is to do what? Adopt the ways. And when you adopt the ways of the people that are engaging in that behavior, then you are that most likely to be less of an imposter. So there's a way in which, and I would say much less of an imposter, but you're not going to be one of them.
Absolutely.
So that's always held up. So there are ways in which I think we want to think about. There are ways in which we want to think about what may be happening for that person. What may be happening for him or her or them that makes this feel like a viable option. Also, so maybe they're playing into particular politics because they want to say, yeah, Bob, I really believe that they're kind of dumb too. And and so now Bob thinks that you're like Bob and you think like Bob and y'all can be friends. Fine. But there's also this piece around the ways in which we've been educated within Western patriarchal sociocultural spaces in education, and that have prepared us and trained us on professionalism and appropriate workplace perspectives and things of that nature. And what is appropriate is not what is African centered. It's not what is Latin centered. It's not influenced by Asian descent cultural expressions. It's not influenced necessarily by a feminist ideal of power and authority and leadership. And so all those ways of being are othered. And so we are also trained that to be professional and to be a leader, unless we've had some other types of experiences, like conversations like this one, we try to align ourselves within that frame. And so some of our colleagues are aligning themselves in that frame because that's where they see advancement. But to be quite honest, that's also where they saw, or where they do see, where the value is, because that's what we've been taught. Critical analysis and perspectives of that are not taught regularly or in every space. So those are some of the things that I would say could be happening. And so systemically and structurally, the culture creates the context and the behavior. The culture creates behavior. That's what's normative. And so, as one of our colleagues in the chat is saying, respectability and professionalism are definitely pieces of that. We definitely have to toe the line, right? Because we want to make sure that we are carrying out professionalism. But what I tend to say with my team is, I need you to show up with the integrity and the the esteem of the position, but do it as you are. So Do it in a way that is authentic and consistent with what you value and where you hold esteem in other places in your life. That's a very different conversation.
It is.
And people can then take some ownership of how they manifest respect for a role or respect for a responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Would you add anything to that, Valithia?
I would, and I think the one word that stands out to me the most is authentic.
That's right.
If you spend your whole time conforming into a system, it is impossible to present or even understand what authenticity looks like to you. Yeah. And I think that it's one of the things that I really stress to my team when I worked in healthcare. Like, you have to be a leader. You must be professional. You must be respectful to other people, but you have to do it in a way that is authentic to you. That's right. So if someone disrespects you, that doesn't, and you addressing them about said disrespect, that doesn't violate being respectable, that doesn't violate professionalism. You can address inappropriateness in a way that is respectable and professional. You know what I mean? Yes. You just have to do it in a way that's authentic to you, that doesn't violate those two pillars.
Yes. Oh, I'm so excited just to be talking to you. And I'm remembering that we said we were going to have this conversation be a part of the podcast. So that's even awesome. I forgot all about it until this very moment. I run a podcast most recently just started called She Been Ready. I'll put the link in the bio or in the chat. But what we agreed is that we would take this conversation that Valithia and I were going to have and put it in, make it one of the episodes for the podcast. It's just so rich, and I knew so many gems were going to come out of it. So let's get on with this. So shushing. Oh, this is a pet peeve of mine. I cannot tell you. Shushing is to be shushed. It's a nonverbal call to be quiet or to interrupt one's speech. So I consider talking over or interrupting someone while they're speaking a form of shushing. I think of that as the same. It's one, it's just rude. But two, it actually serves, some people are allowed to interrupt. And so those are based on power dynamics as well. And they are aligned with gender and race and social and class and disability. There are all the ways in which we make that okay. And they set norms. So it's actually really important for leaders to set norms around how we take time to hear everybody. Okay, let me get back to this so we can get on. I get excited. So it's an external demand that one must discontinue talking, stop sharing their thoughts or their insights, or removing their emotional and intellectual contribution from the discursive space. So there are all sorts of ways in which we can silence or shush somebody. To be seen and not heard because what you think and feel, your interiority, doesn't matter. Your contribution doesn't matter. Every time a Black woman or girl is expected not to have a contribution and therefore engaged as if she has nothing of worth to share, she is being shushed. And I want to say that again. Every time a Black woman or girl is expected not to have a contribution and therefore engaged as if she has nothing worth to share, she is being shushed. She is being reminded that in this space, that is likely every place outside of the community of other Black women and communities in which she leads, she does not matter. We teach young people, we teach girls. I'm on the board of an organization called Girls Leadership, and one of the things that we found in some of our research is that we teach girls not to talk anymore. We teach them not to raise their hand and not to share their opinion because we stop looking at them. We know the research around when a boy raises his hand and a girl raises their hand, who gets called on first. We teach them that. They learn that by how we behave and respond to them. Have you ever been shushed, Valithia?
I have. Something when you first finish speaking, I feel like I'm kind of getting emotional about this. It's actually not me that I get emotional about. I distinctly remember I was in a session with some of my teammates, and I had a Black female frontline staff member, and she said something. We were going through a Kaizen project, which is Lean Six Sigma, and we were thinking about improving a process, right? Frontline workers are usually the ones with the most, knowledge because they live that experience every day. It's what they do every day, right? And we took a break from the session, and she pulled me to the side and she said, "Val, can I talk to you about something?" And I said, "Sure, no problem. What's up?" So she says, "Did you notice in the room I had answered a question, and then a couple of minutes later, you had answered the question, essentially saying the same thing that I said. But when I said it, nobody cared. Everybody just dismissed it." And I said to her, You know, to be 100% honest, I did not notice that, but I
Mm-hmm.
support you in speaking up about it.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I think that through the lived experience of being shushed in many different ways, one of the things that was the most important, and I think this is really important to any leadership position, is to be able to leverage your position to support other people.
Allyship. Talk about it. Yes,
Exactly.
yes,
More
yes.
than just the position, it was my innate responsibility to do that,
That's
right?
right.
I didn't notice it, but I didn't have to, because in the end of the day, if that's how she felt, then that became the reality, right?
That's right.
I know it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so it was really important to support her in speaking up against that, and to also be conscious in the room, because I didn't notice it, right? It bothers me that someone felt that they were shushed and that they were shushed, whether
Mm-hmm.
that was the impressive intent or not. And so
Mm-hmm.
it helped me to be a more conscious leader, to
Mm-hmm.
spot that was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And it helped me to remember that when I'm at the table and someone else is being shushed, to
Mm-hmm.
leverage that position to make it stop. And I'll give you an example.
Mm-hmm.
One of the ways people get shushed when people just start talking over them, right? And I've
Yes.
learned as a leader to say, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I don't think that she was actually finished with her sentence. Were you finished? Oh, you weren't finished? Okay, well, let's go ahead and let her finish her sentence first, right? It
Mm-hmm.
made me a lot more conscious leader, even though I've been through it again. As
Yes.
a leader, it's a different lens. I had to be careful to look for it, right?
Yes.
You don't just notice it, you have to look for it. So
Mm-hmm.
that's what it really
I'm really appreciative that you've given 2 examples of how to be responsive to that in the moment. So one is if someone tells you something after the fact, don't take it personally. Don't feel like, because sometimes what happens from an allyship perspective is that we feel like, oh, I've been a bad ally because I didn't even see that. So maybe now I want to deny that it even happened. So let's not do that. And let's realize that that's really harmful and say, I'm sorry, I did not, but what can we do?
Yeah.
Address it. And then 2, what you just talked about in terms of what you would do in the moment. Excuse me, I'll say one more, which is that when you do notice that someone heard you and didn't hear somebody else, or that you have the same thought, to say, I want to amplify what so-and-so just said.
Exactly.
It is so powerful. And I can tell you that as a woman who leads, a Black woman who leads, who's been in a variety of different spaces, who sits on a number of different tables, like that almost moves me to tear, that show of solidarity, because and then that is someone, if you want to become a friend for life with me, back when it matters.
I agree.
When it matters,
I agree.
So we're going to move on to the final piece of the book, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions, on becoming a refusal politician. There is a whole politics of refusal, and I love it because for me, it sits squarely against these ideas of politics of respectability. The idea that, you know what, I'm not going to do that. What does it mean to refuse? So I write that Black women and girls must become refusal politicians. Refusal is a powerful tactic beneath which Black women and girls have often been recipients of deep harm. So we get in trouble when we refuse. Let it be clear. Having autonomy, making choices, the world is not used to it. They get mad at us. They punish us. They fire us. They tell us, all kind of things. But we still have that is a power that we have that we can claim and reclaim. So it does make us recipients of deep harm, and it is in the act of refusal that Black women and girls can reclaim their power. Taken from some of the examples that I've shared in the text, likely many others, we can collectively call to mind. We can explore how Black women and girls, and I say girls because we have to teach them this, and we have to support them when they're told that they're being unruly or misbehaving or getting detention, because that's a form of the push out that we see with Black and Latinx girls, and any girl who, or folks who are behaving in an othered space. So what I want to articulate is that the work of Dr. Monique Morris and others around looking at push out is really a form of watching our young people being pushed out of school because they're not conforming, because again, we teach it early. All right, so making sure that we support them and we teach them, but we also back them up. So anyway, the Black women, that we will explore how Black women and girls might adopt a politics of refusing to not only preserve their peace, but perhaps most critically recover from the damage drawn from socialization in intersectionally traumatizing ways and context. So refusal is literally to not participate. To simply say that 2-letter word that is also a sentence. What is it? No. No. Not engaging in order to be generative in our own sovereignty. So the idea here is this, that we create more space for ourselves by protecting the space that we have around ourselves. And it's a really important tool and tactic to teach ourselves in the context of our work, but also to teach to young ones. It really will preserve their mental health for us to talk with them about, you have choices, hon. You don't have to always do what people want you to do. You're not compelled. People are not entitled to your energy, to your resource, to your labor. And I hope that as we're in this space together, you all might be realizing some of the spaces where you might make yourselves available and allow people to cross boundaries with you that actually are really bad for your mental health and lead to mental health challenges. Valithia, I feel like the biggest refusal you did was leave. Again, you started with that early inkling of, I can make these candles. Again, your husband saying, you buy too many candles. Like, can you buy some wax and just make candles? But ultimately, that refusal came in the form of creating your own workspace and your own dynamic. What would you add to this idea of refusal? How has refusal shown up in your life and in your work?
Yeah. I would say leaving my healthcare career was really difficult for me because, like I said, I'm very passionate about healthcare. But I think where the most joy stemmed out of it was the refusal of working in an environment that felt like it was worthy of me, but didn't treat me appropriately, right? I feel like you can have the highest self-esteem in the world. You can be the most confident person in the world, right? But when you don't assign this person is violating my worth to a situation, easily can overtake you. The situation can easily be exacerbated, right? And so from refusal, what I've learned the most is that I've learned to categorize my worth, right? And to be very clear about who's worthy of it and who isn't. Yeah, and that's a lesson I take throughout the rest of my life as well.
Who is worthy and who is not. I really do think that making choices about ourselves and our time are really reflective of that. And when I do work with women, I sometimes have to call up their little girl and or the little people that they have been charged to care for, whether they're aunties or mothers or grandparents, to say, you would draw a circle around that baby to protect them. You need to draw one around yourself. Yeah. Because somehow we get bought into and connect with this idea that we are accessible. But why are you don't have to be accessible. And this is not around shaming folks for falling into the socialization that is so real and deep and strong in our society, but rather to name it and to remind so that we can have a reclamation of power and self-authority.
Yeah. I think in addition to that, what I've learned, and I'll be really quick, I know question and answers, is that I don't know any woman who is not sacrificial, right? In many ways, I enjoy being of service to other people, right? But I've had to teach myself to be sacrificial in the right way. It is not healthy for me or anyone else for that matter, for me to be sacrificial towards people who are being abusive or being toxic, right?
That's right.
And there is a question in the chat that says, how do we make this stop? How do we stop normalizing Black women having to endure toxicity? For me, it has been to be sacrificial in a way that speaks up against toxicity, to hold people accountable for said toxicity. I think it's really important because I do think a powerful gift of all women is our ability to sacrifice, our ability to care for others, right? But we need to make sure that we're channeling that energy in the right way.
Your choice, as opposed to it being pulled from you.
Absolutely.
Valithia, this has been such an enriching conversation. We do have 3 minutes left. I know folks have been asking questions along the way in the chat and in the Q&A. We just kind of want to open up the space for that. If you have questions, please ask.
Yeah.
Valithia, are there any final thoughts or questions that you have that you're processing or thinking through?
I don't think so. I'm interested in getting into these questions. I see 2 in the Q&A. One of them was, why are Black women required to endure toxic behavior in order to be successful in the workplace? How can we denormalize these experiences? Do you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I think that the requirement, I think it's an expectation and it's an entitlement based on the foundations of how Black women's labor was introduced to this country. So that's what I will say. And that was toxic. Enslavement, rape, that's toxic. So there's nothing healthy that comes from that. And that's what we're dealing with. I'll also say too, that the abuses and the exploitation that we see as a part of labor markets, period, and the ways that we treat workers is premised on how we have crafted and structured extracted labor from human beings in this country, and that does live right on top of the ideology and practices of enslavement. I think we have to say no, as hard as it is. That's how we denormalize these experiences. I also think that it comes from women like Valithia, who are leading in contexts that sound quite toxic, but lead in a way that is authentic to her. And I think we need to pull up and hear about the leadership legacies and strategies of these types of leaders, because they provide another way. Right now, I think that many people do have some practices that are pretty powerful and healthy, but we don't celebrate or lift those up and provide those as examples. So one of the things I thought was really powerful in our dialogue and conversation today, Valithia, are some of the examples that you shared through your experience, because now people they literally have language they could use in different experiences and instances that they probably just didn't like. They watched it, but from a bystander intervention perspective, you need to know what to do in that moment, not just that you watched it, because sometimes that actually is more traumatizing for the person in that space as well, is that they want to do something, they're just not quite sure what to do. So I think sharing real examples, real words that you use in real context is really helpful.
Yeah. And the last part of the question, how can we denormalize these experiences? I'll just add really quickly to that. I think that we have to speak up. It's the only way I've ever learned to address something that's effective. Let's do it in a way that's respectable and professional, and it can be done. We have to give people explicit example of what's happening. And I think the more powerful thing too, especially in corporate America, is to use the policies of the organization to leverage your argument. Because all organizations have professional conduct policy, right? And that's how you can explain how, this is something that's toxic and disruptive. It doesn't even align with the policy of the organization, right?
Ms. Gal, thank you so much for your question.
Yeah.
I'm just going to share my website, because this is what I do all the time. And I'll share my email. Maybe we can talk at another time, because I'm happy to point you in the direction of resources. I think that, yeah, and there are many, but there also aren't as many as there should be.
So there's one more question. So you addressed that one. I think it's okay. How do you know when self-care is saying no versus standing up and speaking up against the accumulation of harm by constant microaggression? You want to?
Yeah. Like I said, I'm a psychologist, and hello, Ife. Good to see you here. I think that that's a moment-to-moment decision. I talk about intelligent and nuanced boundaries when I work with my clients, because I think that what you say today and what you say next month are two different things based on your mental, emotional landscape and where you happen to be sort of living in that moment. If I'll speak for myself, if I'm coached and therapied up and I feel very strong and confident, yeah, maybe I might lean in and deal with it. But if I'm feeling like I'm a little weathered by what's been going on, and there are things that are happening that have been very stressful and I haven't found remedy, and I'm really working through an issue, now may not be my time to throw my hat in for the struggle. And what my hope is that what we do is cultivate a community of folks, allies, other Black women, other women of color, other folks of color, so that we don't always have to be the ones carrying the torch. I feel like that is destructive, and it actually feeds into white supremacist ideological and cultural ideals around the individual being the spokesperson or being the charismatic leader, as opposed to thinking about more collaborative and collective approaches to leadership. And from that, I'm thinking primarily of the work I draw from Adrienne Marie Brown's work on emergent strategy, and thinking about more collectivistic approaches, or like even the ways that the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement have organized the work to be leaderless, and to have factions all across, and offices and leadership all across that is more flattened, so that the work can be shared. I don't think we don't want to get into the martyrdom of the strong Black woman in this way too, and I think like that's what's so persistent about this, is that those systems are what they are. And so we get kind of locked in, and sometimes we find ourselves in these situations we don't realize how we got here, because we're really fighting not to get here, but it's because the structural and systemic dynamics are what they are.
Yeah. And I think just to add on to that, a little bit earlier, someone talked about emotional intelligence, and I am a huge proponent of emotional intelligence, right? But I also don't want to paint a false narrative. Earlier in my career, where someone would do something that was a microaggressive or something racist, I would be in the bathroom crying, like just being 100% honest, right? it's a muscle that you build over time. And even now, sometimes I'm the most brave and courageous person, and then other times I just need to cry to myself. Like I just need to let it out, right?
Mm.
Emotional intelligence is very important, especially when you have to deal with these microaggressions if you stay in that type of environment. But I
Mhm.
also think it's really important to give yourself grace and to say, you know, today is a little bit too much for me. So today I'm going to be crying to myself. You know, I'm going to cleanse myself, and
Mhm.
tomorrow is a new day. So I just wanted to add that on.
I feel like that is also a very brave decision to make.
Hmm.
Mhm. We are over time. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Valithia, for joining me and for being in a space with me. Thank you all for joining us and being in this conversation with us. This has been so just uplifting. We're going into the weekend with a good feeling. So thank you.